Our topic for the last session touched on the early history where the four children talked about their lives in Fort Bliss from 1946 to 1950 before they arrived in Huntsville. All of the group came under Operation Paperclip, Special Act of Congress. Do any of you need more details on that, or are you pretty well in tune with that story? Pretty well know? I know you do, Brian. All right, well, at the end of World War II, the U.S. government had sought to gain technological advancements from Germany by securing the top scientists, engineers, doctors, professors, and others, foremost in their fields of endeavor. Of approximately the 2,000 brought into the U.S. between 1945 and 1970, Operation Paperclip, there were about 120 rocket specialists, plus their families, who were kept confined for 4 to 5 years at Fort Bliss until the U.S. government decided that they would not send the scientists and families back to Germany, but instead would allow them to legally immigrate and move to Huntsville, Alabama's Redstone Arsenal, to begin work in earnest on rocket development. The Cold War was looming. So the focus of today's panel is resourcefulness of the group. So I'm not going to cover all of this because I'm thinking they're going to cover some of this, but they sent, just to give you a preview, they sent care packages to the families while they were still in Fort Bliss. And some of you have shared great stories with me on that. So I'll give you more details if you like. They also formed a medical insurance while in Fort Bliss because they had none. So they pooled $5 apiece. Werner Kuh's son was the first to need an emergency appendectomy, and he took part in that and then paid it back in installments into the medical group bank. So they built lots of furniture. Von Braun said, finally, stop building the furniture. We've got to focus. So they started giving seminars in the evening. The best English speakers would give English lessons. They were all to teach whatever technical pursuit they had. They were to cover that. So then, and the English lessons continued once they got to Huntsville. Now, most of the families, the majority, lived in Blossomwood or Montesano, and there's an interesting story about Montesano, how they parceled out the lots and so forth. They bought a farm up there, and so now, so we are going to get started. We do have a historian on hand, the real Michael Eugene Baker, better known by his friends as Mule. I can't call him that, but he is Mule, and that's because he endeavors to get things done. He won't quit until he gets it done. Now, he was, until he retired a few years ago, the command historian at Army Materiel Command. So very well versed. He was at AMCOM before that, before Army Materiel moved down here. So he loves the history of early Huntsville Arsenal, Redstone Arsenal. So with that, Mule or Michael, take it away.
My wife gave me grief because I put this mule thing on my little deal. But the story was that I had a chief of staff once that gave me was always giving me taskers, most of them which never had anything to do with history. And this was like 6 or 7 o'clock one night, and he needed some briefing charts done for the next morning. And I said, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. And so as I was walking out the door, he said, you know you're my horse. And I said, sir, with all due respect, I grew up in South Georgia. I had an uncle that raised horses for a living. I know how you treat a horse. I'm just an old mule that's out in the pasture, and you say, come plow the field, and mule's stuck. So it was my honor in the 36, 37 years as a historian that I was able to interview a number of the members of the Von Braun team, both German and American, and there are stories there that are just treasures. But first, before I begin, I want to give you a little background about the Arsenal's roots. In the early part of 1941, the Army's Chemical Warfare Service had only one chemical manufacturing installation, and that was located at Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland. As a result, Congress appropriated over about about $50 million for the Chemical Warfare Service to acquire additional facilities. On the 3rd of July of 1941, a special edition of the Huntsville Times announced that Huntsville had been chosen as the location of the new chemical war plant. Ground for Huntsville Arsenal was broken the next month, and by March 1942, its first production facility was activated. It manufactured chemicals and loaded them into bombs, grenades, and shells. During World War II, this arsenal's personnel produced more than 27 million rounds of chemical munitions having a value of over $134 million. Huntsville was located on about 30,000 acres that extended from what is now Bob Wallace Avenue on the north, the Tennessee River on the south, Patton Road, or on the north part it's Jordan Lane on the east, and now Zerrett Road on the west. Recognizing the economy of locating an ordnance shell loading and assembly plant close to the arsenal, the Army Ordnance Corps chose to build something called the Redstone Ordnance Plant. There's an interesting story about how Redstone got its name, but Heidi wants me to do another presentation on that another time. Ground was broken for the plant on the 25th of October of 1941. The plant was redesignated Redstone Arsenal on the 26th of February 1943. It was located on about 4,000 acres east of and adjacent to Huntsville Arsenal. Redstone Road was the main entrance point. Basically, Redstone workers manufactured ammunition items, including bursters for chemical shells and bombs, and they assembled the items loaded at Huntsville Arsenal into complete rounds. A third activity in 1942 was a chemical depot. Its primary structures were storage bunkers, commonly called igloos, that are still scattered throughout the southern end of the arsenal. Completed munitions were stored here before they were shipped off the arsenal complex via rail or barges. Overall, the complex consisted of about 40,000 acres. Wartime employment peaked at nearly 20,000 for both arsenals, most of whom were women and minorities. Both arsenals operated 24 hours per day. The end of the war brought the production to a screeching halt, and I do mean a screeching halt. The workforce dwindled down to a few hundred. During this period, over 5,000 acres of land on the arsenal complex were leased for agricultural use. This practice is still in use today. Also, some of the empty buildings were leased to private enterprise. An interesting example of this effort is the story of an attempt to develop an automobile assembly plant on arsenal facilities. The Keller Motors Corporation was named for George Keller, the president of a firm and a former executive with Studebaker. The company planned to build what would have been the first compact cars in the United States. Despite having lined up over about 1,500 possible dealerships, the firm struggled for financial backing. It was dealt a mortal blow when its namesake died in October of 1949. The doors to the company were closed shortly after the beginning of 1950. By the late 1940s, things really indeed looked bleak at the arsenal complex. But Colonel, later Major General Holger, he preferred to be known as Ludi, Toftoy's foresight, soon changed all that. If you recall, it was Toftoy who persuaded the Army brass to bring the von Braun team to the United States after World War II. In late 1948, as head of the Army's rocket branch, Toftoy had convinced the Chief of Ordnance to consolidate the Army's rocket activities at Redstone Arsenal. As a result, Redstone Arsenal was officially reactivated as the site of the Ordnance Rocket Center on the 1st of June of 1949. Meanwhile, the Army Corps of Engineers began advertising the 30,000 plus acres that were Huntsville Arsenal for sale. Enter General Toftoy again. Upon learning that the commanding general at Fort Bliss had stated, and I quote, "in no uncertain terms," end quote, that plans to build additional facilities on the Fort Bliss reservation for the new guided missile program could not be approved, Toftoy began looking elsewhere. The master of understatement, Toftoy said this turned out, I quote, "to be a blessing in disguise." He sent Major Jim Hamill and Mr. Jim Fagan in mid-August 1949 to see if the old Huntsville Arsenal facilities might be suited for the expansion of the von Braun team's operations. They found them ideal, so Toftoy began the process of convincing Army leadership to call off the sale of Huntsville Arsenal and move the Fort Bliss group here. There's a great story that Toftoy often told about being sent by the Chief of Ordnance to meet with the Army Vice Chief of Staff, General Matthew Ridgway, about the proposed move. Toftoy said that his map of the Arsenal complex was so large that he had to roll it out on the floor and not having a pointer that was long enough. He got down on his hands and knees to show General Ridgway the specific areas on the map. Toftoy said he finally wound up right in front of General Ridgway. He looked up to him, gave him a big smile and said, "I'm really on my hands and knees, literally and figuratively, begging for this place." Toftoy won with the Secretary of Army approving the transfer of the Fort Bliss group on the 28th of October of 1949. As a result, Huntsville Arsenal was officially discontinued on the 1st of April of 1950, and the major portions of its land and facilities were consolidated into the Redstone Arsenal complex that we know today. Dr. Ernst Stuhlinger once said, and I quote, that the move to Huntsville was certainly the most significant event in the history of the German rocket team, end quote. The team began arriving in Huntsville in April 1950. Here's a story that Dr. Stuhlinger told about their arrival here. Shortly after we had settled in Huntsville, some of us were invited to an evening lecture about the history of Huntsville to be given by a young professor at the Huntsville Extension of the University of Alabama, Miss Frances Roberts. After her talk, which dealt mainly with the dramatic events of the Civil War, one of the listeners asked, "How do you expect the city of Huntsville will accept and absorb this influx of rocket people from Texas?" After a little pause and a deep sigh, Miss Roberts answered, "Well, 90 years ago, our city survived that invasion of Yankees from the north. We may now hope that we'll also survive the present invasion of rocketeers from the west." About 40 years later, after Huntsville's population had grown from about 14,000 to about 170,000, after the little university extension had burgeoned into a fully autonomous university, and after Dr. Roberts, now a highly honored professor emerita, had become the most respected person ever connected with this university, the lady was asked how she feels about that invasion of rocketeers from the west. "Our city," she replied, "has grown in steps. By far the most decisive step came when von Braun and his crew moved here from Texas in 1950. Just everything began to grow in leaps and bounds. The population, stores, housing projects, schools, churches, streets, the cultural life, the symphony orchestra, the wealth of the city, and of course, our university. It was just marvelous." At the time of Toftoy's death in 1967, Senator John Sparkman wrote that he would always remember General Toftoy as a man who was really responsible for the revival and rebuilding of Redstone Arsenal. So I think it appropriate that I close with these prophetic words of General Toftoy in a letter he wrote on the 10th of November 1955 to the commanding general of Redstone in the year 2005. This letter was buried in a time capsule and opened for Huntsville's bicentennial in 2005. General Toftoy said, "There is no doubt in my mind that Redstone Arsenal in the year 2005 will be a world-renowned institution and a mecca for the men of science around the world." Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Now we have 3 children of rocket time. All right.
That's yours.
We're all up there, right? All over 60. So Ursula and Wojciech Van. Then we have Jürgen Haukohl, and then we have Karl Heimberg. Karl Heimberg is your dad, Klaus Heimberg. So,
She made the same.
so we've got some that are mic'd and some, okay, so first
Okay.
Ursula and Wojciech Van.
Thank you. And I want to thank you, Heidi, for prodding me to finally put some of this stuff down on paper. I have some big gaps to fill yet. And today I'd like to share a very short piece on my family background and a little history geography class. By birth, I'm Bohemian as well as Sudeten German, and that always requires some explanation. The Sudetenland was a group of region of 3 states or provinces that was home to a large population of ethnic Germans. Provinces of Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia are now in the Czech Republic and Poland. This region has also been Czechoslovakia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and a long time ago, part of the Holy Roman Empire. Ethnic Germans settled in that region in the 1200s and 1300s. I was born in 1939 in the city of Aussig on the Elbe River, which is now Ústí nad Labem in the Czech Republic. It had been annexed by Germany in 1938, so officially I was born in Germany. As an aside, my mother and my sister were also born in Aussig. However, they were born in Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. And all 4 of my grandparents were also born in Austria-Hungary, which covered a large part of Central Europe. And another quick little introduction was I wrote a little piece about how my father ended up at Peenemünde. When the war broke out in Europe, my father was drafted first into the Czech army, and later after the annexation of the Sudetenland by Hitler, he was in the German army. He was sent to the Eastern Front where he was wounded in combat. As he lay on the ground and played dead, a Russian cavalry soldier came by from his horse, poked my father with his saber to make sure of his status. So the scar on his cheek, which a lot of people think was a fencing scar, was really a wound. He had another smaller scar that was from a fencing incident. Later, as he was recovering in the hospital, the call went out for needed engineers at Peenemünde. He was a mechanical engineer and was recruited. And what a stroke of luck this all turned out to be. His army outfit was sent to Russia, probably Leningrad, and was completely wiped out. He was at Peenemünde from 1942 until the surrender to the Americans at the end of the war. And I didn't learn this story until I was in high school when we spent a Christmas day with good friends, the Holderers, and Dad and Oscar were reminiscing about the war and things, and that's the only time I ever heard him reminisce about the war. So what I put together was really a section piece on life in Fort Bliss. And when my mother, my sister Barbara 4, and my brother Wilfred, almost 2.5, and I at 8, arrived in El Paso in May 47. My father was at the train station in a car. He had bought a 1941 gray Oldsmobile sedan, and it was the first passenger car I had ever ridden in. And my father also met his son for the first time. He had not been home on leave since early 1945, but he did have a photo that my mother had made of the 4 of us shortly after we arrived in Landshut in 1946. By that time, he had already left for America about 6 weeks earlier. In Fort Bliss, the whole team, plus the families, plus a number of Americans and GIs were housed in a fenced compound with MPs at the gates on the outskirts of El Paso. Single-story barracks had been an annex of the William Beaumont Army Hospital. The compound was not being used and belonged to the government. It was located a couple of miles from the hospital at the end of a long straight road from the Franklin Mountains. An Air Force facility, Biggs Field, was across the road, and the El Paso airport was beyond in the desert. The one-story barracks were being converted into apartments and offices. All the long buildings were connected at the end by long enclosed hallways. Probably once there had been doors to each of the buildings. The halls had brown linoleum floors, and the kids soon learned they were great for roller skating and playing and getting reprimanded for that. There were 3 residential streets, A, B, and C. The streets were also connected by enclosed hallways with openings at the street crossings, and that could make for a good bit of walking to visit friends on the next street. The team was at Fort Bliss for about a year before the family started arriving, and most of their pay was transferred to the families in Landshut, Bavaria. And soon the men were sending packages with many of the necessities, plus a few treats that were so scarce in post-war Europe. I know my mother sent Dad the outlines of each of our feet for new shoes. In Fort Bliss, before the families arrived, a few of the men built furniture. My father made several pieces based on some of the furniture we had to abandon. There were sturdy utilitarian pieces like a square dining table with an L-shaped bench and high back. And one of the few pieces he bought was an armchair, a very mid-century modern rattan frame with cushions. I still have it and use it, and I guess that makes it a family antique now. Another project of his was a series of thin wooden cutout wall plaques of characters from the Grimm fairy tales. He used watercolors to paint them, and they were fairly crude, but again, they were based on some I had in Germany, and these still survive with my Nashville daughter. When we first arrived, our apartment was not ready, and we shared a whole barracks building with a Holderer. There was Oscar Inge, his mother Oma Holderer, and his son Thomas, who was also 2. Bushy, my brother, and Thomas became lifelong friends. The rooms at the street became, the arch room at the street end became our living room in one corner and a playroom. The back of the building had a hall and a series of rooms in the kitchen. Most of the meals were communal, which was a big help for my mother since the Holderers had been here for almost a year and were getting familiar with the new foods. One of the rooms became their living room, and there were plenty of bedrooms. Oscar and my father also had a dark room in one of those rooms. I was occasionally allowed to sit in there as they developed film. It was fascinating to see the images appear on the paper. They documented events around the compound as well as the surrounding area. And these photos were offered to the other families, so they had a small business going. I have very few of these, but I'm sure Thomas has a file. We soon moved to our apartment on B Street. It was next to a building that had become offices and drafting rooms. Beyond that was one of the crosswalks and then a small PX. Our family had the unit in the back. Next to us were the Voss family, then Bruno Heusinger, and finally Rudy and Doretta Schlitt. There was a sizable group of children there, roughly my age, 7 or 8 to 10 years old when we arrived. Dodgeball, kickball, and roller skating were favorite outdoor activities among the girls anyway. A swimming pool was on the compound, and many of us learned to swim there. The famous photograph of the entire team in 1946 was taken in front of that. My first summer in 1947, the Army, summer in Fort Bliss, the Army, which was in charge of us, organized a summer school so we could learn some English. Come September, the whole group of school-age kids was bused into El Paso to the city schools. I was put in the 3rd grade at Crockett School, and the other 2 German girls in the class